Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. I'm an emergency doctor. I keep getting patients with government tags embedded in their skin, and they all say the same thing. They're coming for you next. Last night, one of them called me by a name I haven't used in years. Working nights as an ER doctor, you see things that make you question reality. Things you never bring up in polite conversation. But there's something I need to share because it's been haunting me for weeks now. I feel like if I don't get it out, I'll lose my mind. It started 3 weeks ago. It was a typical night shift, and I was running on caffeine and the occasional granola bar. Around 3 a.m., the witching hour of the ER, we got a call from paramedics about a patient found unconscious in an alley downtown. Homeless, mid-30s, male, no ID, just another nameless face in the city's underbelly, or so I thought. The man was in bad shape, hypothermic, malnourished, and mumbling nonsense. We rushed him into a trauma bay, stabilizing him, hooking him up to fluids. While cleaning his wounds, I noticed something strange, a small metallic tag embedded under the skin of his forearm. It wasn't like anything I'd seen before. It was about the size of a grain of rice, smooth and cold to the touch. It had faint markings, almost like a barcode, but the numbers were weird, longer than usual, like some kind of serial number. "Did he say anything?" I asked the nurse, assisting me. "Not much," she replied. "Something about someone coming for him." She sounded unsure, like she didn't want to admit she was freaked out. That's when he suddenly woke up. I'll never forget how his eyes snapped open, bloodshot, darting around the room, full of pure terror. He grabbed my wrist with a strength I wouldn't have expected from someone so frail. "They're coming for you next," he hissed, his voice raspy but urgent. I froze. "Who's coming?" He didn't answer. His breathing became erratic and the monitors started screaming as his heart rate spiked. We did everything we could, but within minutes he was gone. I chalked it up to paranoia, maybe the effects of prolonged drug use. The guy was clearly out of his mind. But something about the way he said it stuck with me. After the patient died, I couldn't stop thinking about the tag in his arm. I brought it up to my attending physician, but he waved it off. Probably some kind of implant. They use them for tracking animals or medical devices. Don't overthink it. But it didn't feel right. The placement, the markings, it was too deliberate. Against protocol, I took a picture of it before we sent the body to the morgue. Something about it made my skin crawl, but I couldn't put my finger on why. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying his last words in my head. "They're coming for you next." The next incident happened 3 nights later. Another patient, this time a woman in her late 20s, was brought in after a car accident. She was lucid but agitated, refusing to let anyone touch her. When I approached her, she locked eyes with me and said, "You have to get it out. They'll find me if you don't." I thought she was talking about glass or debris from the crash. But then she rolled up her sleeve and pointed to her forearm. Sure enough, there it was. A tag, just like the first one. Same size, same strange markings. "What is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Her face twisted in fear. "They track us with them. It's how they know where we are. Please, you have to take it out. You have to." I hesitated. Removing it wasn't exactly in my job description, but her desperation got to me. Against my better judgment, I made a small incision and extracted the tag. As soon as it was out, she visibly relaxed. "Thank you," she whispered, "but it's too late for me." "What do you mean?" "They're coming," she said, her voice trembling. "And now they'll come for you too." She didn't die like the first patient, but she refused to stay in the hospital. Security cameras caught her sneaking out of the building around 4 a.m. A pattern. By now, I was starting to see a pattern. Over the next week, 3 more patients came in with similar tags. All of them were terrified, mumbling about being tracked, about them coming. One man even tried to cut the tag out of his own arm with a broken bottle before collapsing in the waiting room. I started keeping a file, pictures of the tags, notes about the patients, anything that might help me figure out what was going on. But the more I looked into it, the less sense it made. The tags didn't match any known medical implants. I even asked a friend in radiology to scan one. He said it didn't show up on X-rays or CT scans, which shouldn't be possible for something made of metal. Last night was the breaking point. Another patient, a man in his 40s, was brought in after collapsing on the street. He was pale, shaking, and muttering under his breath. As I examined him, he grabbed my hand and said, "They're watching you now, Mike." I froze. No one calls me Mike anymore. It's a nickname I haven't used since college, and it's not on any of my hospital records. "How do you know that name?" I demanded. "They told me," he said, his eyes wide with fear. "They know everything. And they're coming for you next." His vitals crashed after that, and we couldn't save him. I don't know what's happening, but I feel like I'm being watched. My apartment feels different, like someone's been inside. I've started noticing strange cars parked near my building, drivers who look away when I try to make eye contact. I don't know who they are, but I think the patients were right. They're coming for me next. The night after the last patient died, I started noticing the van. At first, I thought it was just my overworked mind playing tricks on me. Night shifts can mess with your head, and I've had my fair share of paranoia after long shifts. But this felt different. It was parked across the street from my apartment when I got home. A black van with tinted windows, engine idling, no markings on the side. I wouldn't have thought twice about it if it wasn't still there the next morning when I left for work. At first, I told myself it was a coincidence, maybe a delivery driver, maybe someone waiting for a friend. I wanted to believe that, because the alternative made my skin crawl. But then it started showing up everywhere. When I stopped for coffee on the way to the hospital, I saw it parked 2 spaces down. When I got off my shift that night, it was waiting at the end of the hospital parking lot. I even tried taking a different route home, driving through side streets I'd never used before. But when I pulled into my apartment complex, there it was again. I finally worked up the courage to approach it. My heart was pounding as I crossed the street, trying to keep my face neutral. I knocked on the driver's side window. No response. I knocked again, harder this time. "Hey, do you need something?" The engine revved, and the van pulled away without a word. The file. The next day, I brought the file I'd been keeping to a friend of mine, Jacob, who works in IT. He's one of those guys who knows how to dig up anything online, no matter how obscure. If anyone could figure out what those tags were, it was him. We met at a diner just outside the city, the kind of place where the coffee tastes like burnt rubber, but no one asked questions. I handed him the pictures of the tags and told him about the patients, leaving out the part about them knowing my name. Jacob studied the pictures for a long time, his face unusually serious. "These don't look like anything I've ever seen," he said, "but I can run them through some databases, see if I can find a match." "Do it," I said, "and let me know if you find anything, even if it's nothing." He nodded, slipping the pictures into his bag. "I'll need a few days." That night, I barely slept. Every little noise in my apartment felt amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the fridge, even the faint rustle of the wind outside. But around 2 a.m., I heard something that didn't belong. It was a soft tapping, like someone lightly drumming their fingers against glass. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was coming from the window in my living room. I don't live on the ground floor. Slowly, I got out of bed and crept toward the living room, my heart pounding so loud, I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. I didn't turn on any lights. I didn't want to alert them that I was awake. When I reached the window, I stood to the side and peeked out. There was nothing there. The tapping stopped as soon as I looked. The next shift, I noticed something that sent chills down my spine. The first patient, the man who had died in the ER, was listed as missing from the morgue. I pulled the report up on the hospital's computer system, thinking it had to be a mistake. Bodies don't just disappear. There are protocols, cameras, checks and balances. But there it was, plain as day. His body had been signed out by someone who didn't exist. The name on the release form didn't match anyone on staff, and the contact number was fake. I called the morgue supervisor, a guy named Alan, to ask what was going on. He sounded rattled. "I don't know what to tell you, man. The cameras glitched that night, and by the time we noticed he was gone, it was too late. It's like someone knew exactly what they were doing." "What about the tag?" I asked. "What tag?" I hung up without answering. The message. When I got home that night, I found an envelope taped to my door. No name, no return address, just a plain white envelope. My hands were shaking as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 4 words written in blocky, uneven handwriting. "Stop asking questions, Mike." The final straw came the next day. Jacob called me, his voice trembling. "Mike, we need to talk," he said. "I don't know what you've gotten yourself into, but this is bad." "What did you find?" I traced the markings on the tags. They're not from any known manufacturer, but I found a pattern in the serial numbers. They match coordinates, specific locations. "Locations for what?" "I don't know," he said. "But one of them is your apartment." The line went dead. I didn't sleep that night. Jacob's words kept replaying in my head. One of them is your apartment. What were the other locations? Who put those coordinates into the tags, and why? And why the hell did they know where I lived? I tried calling Jacob back, but the call wouldn't go through. I tried texting him, but the messages just hung there unsent. My stomach churned with a mix of fear and guilt. What if I dragged him into something dangerous? By morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to go to his place, but when I got there, his apartment was empty. Not just empty, scrubbed clean. There were no pictures on the walls, no furniture, no sign that anyone had ever lived there. The neighbors claimed they'd never heard of him. It was like Jacob had been erased. When I got back to my apartment, I felt off. It's hard to explain. The air felt heavier, like I wasn't alone. I checked every room, opening closets, looking under the bed, even checking the shower. Nothing. But when I locked the door and turned to head back into the living room, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, too tall and too still to be mine, stretched across the hallway wall. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I was facing the door, so the shadow couldn't have been behind me. But when I turned around, the hallway was empty. I didn't sleep that night either. The next day at the hospital, I thought maybe work would distract me. The ER is chaotic on a good day, and with winter flu season in full swing, it was busier than ever. I was stitching up a patient when one of the nurses pulled me aside. "Dr. Michaels," she said, her voice low. "There's a man in the lobby asking for you." "Who is he?" She shrugged. "Didn't say. Just keeps repeating your name." My stomach dropped. I followed her to the lobby, and sure enough, there he was. A tall, wiry man in a long black coat, standing unnaturally still in the middle of the room. His face was pale and drawn, and his eyes had this emptiness to them that made my skin crawl. When he saw me, he smiled. "Dr. Michaels," he said, his voice flat and almost robotic. "They sent me to deliver a message." "Who sent you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, metallic object. He placed it on the counter in front of me and walked out without another word. I picked it up, and my blood ran cold. It was one of the tags. I spent the rest of my shift on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder. By the time I got home, I was exhausted, but sleep still felt impossible. I couldn't stop staring at the tag. There was something different about this one. It had the same markings, but it also had a small notch at one end, like it was meant to fit into something. That's when I remembered the envelope from a few nights ago. I still had it tucked away in my desk. I grabbed it and examined it closely. On the back, hidden under the flap, was a faint imprint, an outline that matched the shape of the tag perfectly. My hands were shaking as I slid the tag into the slot. Click. The envelope split open, revealing a small, folded piece of paper inside. It had another set of coordinates, along with a single sentence. "You'll understand when you get there." The coordinates led to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. I don't know what possessed me to go there, but something about it felt inevitable, like I didn't have a choice. The warehouse was massive, with broken windows and rusted metal siding. The air smelled like mildew and decay. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The place was eerily silent, except for the occasional drip of water echoing in the distance. In the center of the room was a metal table. On the table was a file, just like the one I'd been keeping on the tags. I approached it cautiously, half expecting someone to jump out of the shadows. When nothing happened, I opened the file. Inside were photographs, grainy, black and white images of people. Most of them were patients I'd seen in the ER, the ones with the tags. But there were others too, people I didn't recognize. At the bottom of the pile was a picture of me. Next to the file was a small recorder. I hesitated for a moment before pressing play. At first, there was just static, then a voice, a distorted, mechanical voice that sent shivers down my spine. "You've been chosen, Doctor." "Michaels," it said. "Your role is critical. The others failed, but you cannot." "Who are you?" I whispered, even though I knew it couldn't hear me. "They are watching," the voice continued. "Do not trust anyone, not your colleagues, not your friends, not even yourself. The time is near." The recording ended abruptly, leaving me in silence. When I stepped outside the warehouse, the black van was waiting for me. This time I didn't try to approach it. I didn't even look at it for more than a second. I just got in my car and drove. But no matter where I went, it followed. I took turns at random, ran red lights, even pulled into a crowded gas station and waited. When I got back on the road, the van was right behind me. By the time I got home, I was shaking so badly I could barely get my key into the lock. There was another envelope waiting for me, taped to my bathroom mirror. This one had no words, just a single photograph inside, a picture of me, sitting at my desk at the hospital. It was taken that same day. The photograph shook me to my core. Someone had been in the hospital, close enough to take a picture of me without me noticing. My paranoia was spiraling out of control, but I had no choice but to keep working. Patients don't stop needing doctors, even when your own life feels like it's falling apart. The ER was quieter than usual that night, which only made me more uneasy. Around 2 a.m., just as I started to think I might get a breather, the automatic doors slid open. A man stumbled in, holding his arm. His clothes were filthy, his face pale and drenched with sweat. He looked familiar, but I couldn't place him. "Help me," he gasped, collapsing onto the floor. I rushed over, calling for a stretcher. The nurses helped me lift him, and as we wheeled him into a trauma bay, I finally got a good look at his face. It was Jacob. He was barely conscious, his lips moving as if he was trying to speak. I leaned in close, desperate to hear him. "They know," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "They know about you, Mike. They're a leady here." "Who's here?" I asked, gripping his hand. "What's going on?" He opened his mouth to answer, but all that came out was a strangled gasp. His body went rigid and the monitors started blaring. We worked on him for nearly 20 minutes, doing everything we could to stabilize him. But he was gone. When I pulled off my gloves, I noticed something glinting on his arm. Another tag. This one was different, though. It had a strange, glowing blue light at its center. Faint, but unmistakable. "What the hell is this?" I muttered. The nurse standing next to me glanced at it and took a step back. I don't think we should touch it." After Jacob's body was taken to the morgue, I stepped outside for some air. The hospital parking lot was empty, eerily quiet under the flickering streetlights. That's when I saw him. A man in a suit, standing under one of the lights, staring at me. He wasn't moving, just standing there, perfectly still, his face obscured by shadows. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Every instinct in my body told me to go back inside, but I couldn't look away. "Can I help you?" I called out, my voice echoing in the silence. He didn't respond. Instead, he slowly raised his hand and pointed at me. I took a step back, my heart racing. "Who are you? What do you want?" Still no response. And then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. The next day, I decided to visit the morgue. I needed to know if Jacob's body and the tag were still there. Alan, the morgue supervisor, looked surprised to see me. "What's up, Mike? Another missing patient," he joked, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. "I need to see the body from last night," I said. He raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He led me to the cold storage unit and unlocked it. When he pulled out the drawer, my stomach dropped. The body was gone. Alan looked just as shocked as I felt. "I don't understand," he stammered. "I logged it myself this morning. The cameras were working. This shouldn't be possible." "What about the tag?" I asked. "What tag?" he said, his confusion genuine. Back in my office, I sat down and tried to piece everything together. My hands were shaking as I opened the recorder I'd taken from the warehouse. There was a second file on it, one I hadn't noticed before. I pressed play. At first there was static, then the same distorted voice from before. "You are being watched," it said. "Your actions have consequences. The system is fragile, and you are a threat to its stability." "What system?" I whispered, even though I knew it couldn't hear me. "The tags are markers," the voice continued. "Identifiers for those who know too much. You have been marked." The recording ended with a sound that made my blood run cold. A faint tapping, just like the one I'd heard on my window. When I got home that night, I found my door slightly ajar. My first instinct was to call the police, but something told me they wouldn't be able to help. Instead, I grabbed the heaviest object I could find, a wrench from under the sink, and stepped inside. The apartment was dark, but I could feel it immediately. Someone had been here. Drawers were open, papers scattered everywhere. The file I'd been keeping on the tags was gone. In its place was a single sheet of paper, taped to the wall above my desk. It had 2 words written on it, scrawled in thick black marker. "Stop digging." That night, I didn't bother trying to sleep. I sat in my living room with all the lights on, the wrench still in my hand. Around 3 a.m., the tapping started again. It was louder this time, more insistent. I forced myself to get up and walk to the window, my heart hammering in my chest. When I looked out, I saw the same shadow from before, stretching across the wall of the building opposite mine. But this time, it wasn't alone. There were 2 more shadows, both taller than any human could possibly be. They moved slowly, unnaturally, shifting in a way that made my stomach churn. I didn't stick around to watch. I grabbed my keys and ran. The address led to an industrial park on the outskirts of the city, a sprawling wasteland of empty warehouses and overgrown lots. The air was thick with the smell of oil and metal, and the only sound was the faint hum of distant machinery. I parked at the end of a long gravel road and stared at the building ahead. It was squat and windowless, with a rusted metal door and no signs or markings. Just being near it made my skin crawl. I almost turned back. Every rational part of me was screaming to leave, to call someone, anyone, and let them handle it. But deep down, I knew this was something I had to face alone. I stepped out of the car, my breath clouding in the cold night air. As I approached the door, I noticed a small keypad beside it. The tag. I pulled it from my pocket and held it up to the keypad. The blue light on the tag pulsed once, and the door clicked open. Inside, the interior was nothing like I expected. The walls were sterile white, the floors gleaming under harsh fluorescent lights. The air was cool and clinical, and the faint hum of machinery was louder now, coming from somewhere deeper inside. The hallway stretched out in both directions, identical doors lining the walls. I chose a direction at random and started walking. The first few doors were locked, but eventually I found one that opened. Inside was a small room, completely bare except for a single chair in the center. On the chair was a file, identical to the one I'd found in the warehouse. I hesitated before opening it. Inside were more photographs, but these weren't of the patients, they were of me. One was taken outside my apartment. Another showed me walking into the hospital. There was even one of me sitting in my car, staring at the van. Underneath the photos was a single sheet of paper. It had one sentence written on it. "You are being observed." I left the room and continued down the hallway, my heart pounding. Eventually I came to a set of double doors marked observation. They weren't locked. The room beyond was massive, filled with rows of monitors, each one displaying a different feed. Most of them showed live footage of the hospital, hallways, patient rooms, even the ER lobby. Others showed places I didn't recognize, but one monitor stopped me cold. It was showing my apartment. The feed was live. I could see the empty coffee mug on my table, the blanket I'd left crumpled on the couch. They'd been watching me the whole time. As I stood there, frozen, the lights flickered. A low hum filled the room, followed by a mechanical voice coming from somewhere above me. "Dr. Michaels," it said, "you were warned." I spun around, searching for the source, but the room was empty. "Who are you?" I shouted. "What do you want from me?" There was a pause, and then the voice responded, "We are the system. The observers. You have interfered." "Interfered with what?" "With order," it said. "The tags are necessary. The patients were not your concern." "What do the tags do?" I demanded. There was another pause, longer this time. When the voice spoke again, it was quieter, almost regretful. "They mark the expendable." I stumbled back, my mind racing. The patients, they weren't random, they weren't crazy. They'd been chosen, marked for something, and I had gotten too close. "Why me?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You are a variable," the voice said. "A risk to the system. Your curiosity has compromised our work." "What work?" "Preservation," it said simply. "Of control. Of balance I didn't understand, but I didn't have time to process it." The monitors flickered, and one by one the feeds went dark. "Leave," the voice commanded. "This is your only warning." I didn't wait to be told twice. I ran back the way I came, my footsteps echoing in the empty halls. But as I reached the exit, I heard it, the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. I didn't look back. The door slammed shut behind me as I burst into the night, my lungs burning from the effort. I fumbled with my keys, practically throwing myself into the car. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The black van was there, its headlights piercing the darkness. By the time I reached my apartment, the van was gone. But I knew this wasn't over. When I stepped inside, I found one last note waiting for me, taped to the wall above my bed. It was different from the others, handwritten this time, the letters shaky and uneven. "This is not your fight. Leave it alone, or you will be next." That was 2 days ago. I haven't seen the van since, but the feeling of being watched hasn't gone away. The hospital has been quieter too. None of the patients with tags have come in, and I haven't heard from Jacob, or whatever was left of him. I want to believe it's over, that I can go back to my life and pretend none of this ever happened. But deep down, I know better. They're still out there, watching, waiting, and I'm afraid it's only a matter of time before they come for me again. When I got to my car, I found another note taped to the windshield. This one had an address on it, along with a single line of text. "This is your last chance." I didn't recognize the address, but I knew I had no choice. I work in the archives at a research lab. I found a video of myself working here, recorded 10 years ago. The person in the video looks just like me, only they don't age and they're always watching the camera. Let me start by saying I'm not some conspiracy theorist or a guy who spends hours reading about parallel dimensions or simulation theories. I'm just a regular guy working a boring job. Or, well, that's what I thought until last week. I work as an archivist at a private research lab. The place is one of those anonymous grey buildings you drive past without giving a second thought. You'd never guess that inside, some of the brightest minds are working on projects so classified, even I don't know what half of them are about. My job is pretty straightforward. Organise and catalogue files, mostly digital, and keep the lab's records spotless. Think of it like being a librarian, but for data that people probably shouldn't know exists. It's a quiet job. Most of the time, it's just me, my second-hand office chair, and an old desktop humming in the corner. Honestly, I don't mind. I've always liked working behind the scenes, away from the drama. But last week, while I was reorganizing some old media files, I found something that flipped my entire world upside down. It started like any other day. I was sifting through a folder labeled Closed Projects 2014 when I noticed a file that didn't belong. Most of the files in that folder were boring, test results, technical documents, raw data. But this one, it was a video file, simply named 001.mp4. Here's the weird part. It wasn't dated like the other files. Usually there's a timestamp or some metadata attached. Not this one. It was just there, out of place. Curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked it open. The video started with static, like an old VHS tape, but it quickly cleared up. What I saw next made my stomach drop. It was a view of an office, a cramped space with shelves lined with binders and a cluttered desk covered in sticky notes. My office. At first, I thought it was some kind of surveillance footage. Maybe they had cameras set up before I started working here. But then I noticed something else. Sitting at the desk, typing away, was me. I froze. Not someone who looked like me, not a distant relative or some doppelganger. It was me, down to the slightly crooked nose and the small scar on my chin I got from a biking accident when I was 12. Same tired eyes, same nervous habit of tapping my fingers on the desk when I'm thinking. I watched, heart pounding, as the me in the video worked quietly at the computer. The timestamps on the screen showed it was recorded in 2014. That's 10 years ago. And yet the person in the video looked exactly the same as I do now. Not younger, not older, the same. I tried to tell myself it was a joke. Maybe someone found an old video of me and doctored it as a prank. But that didn't make sense. I didn't start working here until last year. And why would anyone bother going to such lengths for a joke? The video continued, uneventful, but deeply unsettling. My other self was completely focused on the screen, occasionally glancing at a binder on the desk or jotting something down on a notepad. But there was something about the way he moved that felt off, almost robotic. And then, as if he knew I was watching, he stopped typing, turned his head, and stared directly into the camera. I jumped in my chair. The way he stared wasn't natural. His eyes locked on the camera like he could see me through the screen. He didn't blink. He didn't move. Just this dead-eyed stare that seemed to pierce right through me. The video ended abruptly after that. No explanation, no sound, just black. I sat there for what felt like forever, replaying the video in my mind. My first instinct was to delete it. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I didn't want any part of it. My finger hovered over the delete button before I stopped myself. What if this was important? What if deleting it made things worse? Instead, I copied the file onto a flash drive and shoved it into my pocket. I told myself I'd look at it later, maybe show it to someone. But as the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake. It felt like I'd touched something I wasn't supposed to, like I'd opened a door I couldn't close. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw myself staring back at me, unblinking, unfeeling. At one point, I got up and plugged the flash drive into my laptop, hoping I'd somehow imagined it all. But when I played the video again, it was exactly the same office, the same unchanging version of me, the same impossible timestamp. Then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. At the very end of the video, just before the screen went black, there was a single frame of text. I almost missed it because it flashed so quickly, but I paused the video at the right moment. The text read, "This is only the beginning." After seeing that final frame of text, "This is only the beginning," I felt like my stomach had been filled with ice. My first instinct was to shut my laptop and pretend none of this was happening, but the words lingered in my mind, repeating over and over like a warning. The next morning at work, I couldn't focus. My hands kept shaking every time I tried to type, and I felt like someone was watching me. Not in the paranoid, "I'm just imagining it" kind of way. It was a real, tangible sensation, like eyes were drilling into the back of my head. I kept glancing around, but my office was empty. Around noon, my boss, Dr. Andrews, poked his head into my office. He's the kind of guy who's always too busy to stop and chat, so when he does, it's usually important. He didn't even bother with pleasantries. "Need you to clear out the old media storage room today," he said, avoiding eye contact. "We're repurposing the space." I nodded, trying not to sound as rattled as I felt. "Sure thing. Any particular files I should look out for?" "Just the usual," he said quickly. "Anything marked for deletion, get rid of it. The rest, transfer to the main archive." He hesitated, then added, "And don't touch anything labelled red line. Forward those to me." "Red line?" I asked. "What's that?" His jaw tightened. "Don't ask questions. Just do it." Before I could press him further, he was gone, leaving me with more questions than answers. Red line? I'd been working here for over a year and never heard of it. The media storage room was tucked away in the basement, past a long, dimly lit corridor that always gave me the creeps. I'd only been down there once before, when I first started, and I remembered thinking it felt more like a morgue than a storage space. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically, and the air smelled stale, like it hadn't been circulated in years. When I reached the room, I immediately noticed something odd. The door was heavy, almost vault-like, with a keypad for entry. I punched in my employee code, but the light on the keypad flashed red. I tried again. Same result. Frustrated, I called Dr. Andrews. "Your code won't work down there," he said, his voice clipped. "Use this instead." He rattled off a string of numbers, and when I entered them, the lock clicked open. The room itself was a disaster. Piles of old hard drives, labelled disks, and dusty file boxes stacked haphazardly. It was going to take hours to sort through everything. I sighed and got to work, trying to push the events of the last few days out of my mind. About an hour in, I found the first redline folder. It was a plain manila folder with nothing but a single piece of paper inside, listing a series of file names and corresponding access codes. I didn't recognize any of the file names, but one of them stood out, 001 .mp4. My heart started racing. I flipped through the rest of the folder, hoping to find some kind of explanation, but that was it. Just the list. I should have stopped there. I should have brought the folder straight to Dr. Andrews like he told me to, but instead, I kept digging. Something about the way the file name stood out, something about the way it felt like it was calling to me, made it impossible to stop. Buried under a stack of old binders, I found a small external hard drive with a red sticker on it. My hands were trembling as I plugged it into the ancient desktop in the corner of the room. It took forever to boot up, the fans wheezing like an asthmatic smoker, but eventually the drive's contents popped up on the screen. There were dozens of video files, all unlabeled except for a string of numbers. My stomach dropped when I realized all the timestamps were from before the lab was even built. Some dated back as far as the 1980s. The first video I clicked on showed a man I didn't recognize sitting in a stark white room under fluorescent lights. He was wearing what looked like a lab coat, and he seemed calm until he wasn't. Halfway through the video, he suddenly grabbed his head and started screaming, his eyes rolling back as he convulsed violently. Then, just as suddenly, he stopped, slumping forward like a puppet with its strings cut. Another video showed a woman staring blankly into the camera for several minutes. She didn't move, didn't blink. Her mouth was slightly open, like she was about to say something, but she never did. The screen went black, and I almost thought the video was over until she whispered, "Don't let them see you." I leaned back, my pulse pounding in my ears. These videos shouldn't exist. They felt wrong, like I was watching something that defied explanation. But nothing prepared me for the final video I clicked on. It was my office again, just like in 001.mp4. But this time, the camera angle was different, positioned lower, almost as if someone was hiding under my desk. The timestamp said it was recorded 3 days ago. I watched in horror as I saw myself enter the room, sit at my desk, and start typing. The video was grainy and distorted, but it was unmistakably me. The same clothes, the same tired expression. And then, just like before, I stopped typing and looked directly at the camera. Only this time, I wasn't staring blankly. I was smiling. The smile wasn't natural. It was too wide, too forced, stretching my face in ways that didn't seem human. My reflection in the video leaned closer to the camera, until all I could see were my own unblinking eyes staring back at me. And then, in a voice that sounded like mine but wasn't, it said, "You're not supposed to be here." The video cut to static. I didn't remember leaving the storage room. One moment, I was staring at the static on the screen, heart pounding in my ears, and the next, I was back in my office. The door was locked, and I was sitting at my desk like nothing had happened. It took me a few seconds to realize I was holding something in my hand, the hard drive. I must have unplugged it and taken it with me, but I had no memory of doing so. My first thought was to turn it over to Dr. Andrews. But every time I stood up, my legs felt like jelly, and I couldn't convince myself to move. Instead, I slid the hard drive into my desk drawer, locked it, and tried to act normal. But the harder I tried, the more everything around me seemed off. The fluorescent lights above my desk buzzed louder than usual, flickering in random patterns that felt almost deliberate. My computer, which was always painfully slow, suddenly started running so fast that it almost seemed alive. Documents were opening and closing on their own, lines of text scrolling across the screen before I could read them. It was as if the building itself was trying to push me out. By the time my shift ended, I was a wreck. The thought of going home was tempting, but part of me didn't want to leave. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like whatever was happening would only get worse if I turned my back on it. Before leaving, I decided to walk the long way out of the building, passing through the main lab. I wanted to see if anyone else was still working, if someone, anyone, could explain what the hell was going on. But the moment I stepped into the hallway, I regretted it. The air was cold. Not the kind of cold you feel when someone cranks up the AC, but the kind of bone-deep chill that makes your body instinctively tense up. The lights in the hallway were dimmer than they should have been, casting long, warped shadows that didn't quite match the objects they belonged to. I could hear faint whispers. They weren't words exactly, more like the static-filled sound of a radio station that couldn't quite tune in. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Maybe I was just jumpy after everything that had happened. But then I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that didn't belong. It was standing at the end of the hallway near the double doors that led to the main lab, tall, motionless, and completely featureless. At first, I thought it might have been a trick of the light, maybe a coat rack or some equipment casting a weird shadow, but as I stared, I realized it wasn't just standing still. It was watching me. I couldn't see any eyes, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and suffocating. My legs refused to move. I told myself to turn around, to go back the way I came. But I couldn't. Something about the shadow held me in place, like I was tethered to the floor. And then, as if it had read my thoughts, it moved. It didn't walk. It didn't slide. It simply shifted closer, like it was collapsing the space between us. One moment, it was at the end of the hallway, and the next, it was halfway down. The whispering grew louder, but it wasn't coming from the shadow. It was coming from the walls, the ceiling, inside my own head. I stumbled back, heart hammering in my chest, and managed to force my legs to move. I didn't dare look back as I sprinted toward the stairs, my only thought being to get as far away as possible. The sound of my own footsteps echoed louder than they should have, like the hallway was stretching out behind me, swallowing me whole. When I reached the stairwell, I slammed the door shut behind me and leaned against it, gasping for breath. The whispers were gone. The air felt normal again, though I was drenched in cold sweat. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. And then I heard the sound of footsteps on the stairs above me. They were slow, deliberate, like someone descending one step at a time. I tilted my head back and stared up the spiraling staircase. But I couldn't see anything beyond the dim glow of the emergency lights. "Hello?" My voice was barely more than a whisper, shaky and desperate. The footsteps stopped. I don't know what I was expecting, a response maybe, or even silence. But what I got was worse. The lights above me flickered, and for a split second, I saw something standing on the landing above. It was the shadow again, but closer this time, too close. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet, and burst out into the parking lot. The cold night air hit me like a slap to the face, but I didn't stop running until I was inside my car with the doors locked. The drive home was a blur. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadow sitting in the back seat. But the car was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. Even when I pulled into my driveway and ran inside, locking every door and window behind me, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. That night, I had a dream, or at least I think it was a dream. I was back in my office, sitting at my desk, watching the video of myself again. But this time, the me on the screen wasn't just staring at the camera. He was speaking. "You shouldn't have looked," he said, his voice distorted and wrong, like it was being played backward. "They know you now." When I woke up, my phone was buzzing. It was an email from an unknown sender. No subject, no message, just a single attachment. 001.mp4. I stared at the email on my phone for what felt like an eternity. The attachment -001.mp4. Seeing that file name again made my chest tighten. My first thought was to delete it, pretend I'd never seen it. But I couldn't. A part of me needed to know what was on it. The rational part of my brain told me it was a trick, a virus, or someone messing with me. But something deeper whispered otherwise. I hesitated before opening it. The video loaded quickly, and the screen filled with static for a moment before the familiar image of my office appeared. Only this time it wasn't just me at the desk. There were others. 3 figures stood in the background, partially obscured by the dim lighting. They weren't people, not entirely. Their shapes were vaguely human but distorted, like their bodies had been stretched or compressed in ways that shouldn't be possible. One of them was hunched over, its arms dangling unnaturally long. Another had a head that seemed to tilt at an impossible angle, as though it had no bones at all. The third stood perfectly still, its outline sharp and unnerving, as if it were cut from the air itself. And then there was me, or the thing that looked like me, sitting at the desk, typing away as if none of it was happening. I watched, paralyzed, as the me in the video stopped typing and turned toward the camera. Slowly, the figures behind it followed, their heads snapping in unison to face the screen. Their faces were blank, smooth planes of skin, without eyes, noses, or mouths. Yet I could feel their focus, their awareness, like they were studying me through the screen. My breathing grew shallow as I leaned closer to the phone, unable to tear my eyes away. Then the video glitched, and the scene changed. Now, the camera was in my house. The view was from the corner of my living room, aimed directly at the couch where I was sitting. My phone slipped from my hands, hitting the floor with a dull thud. The me on the screen was in the exact same position I was in now, staring at the camera with wide, terrified eyes. But there was something wrong with the reflection of the room. It was darker, the shadows longer, deeper, and then I saw them again, the figures. They were behind me, just out of focus, standing at the edge of the living room. The one with the tilted head started moving, its body jerking as though it didn't quite know how to walk. It took a step forward, then another. My reflection on the screen didn't react, didn't flinch, just sat there, staring blankly at the camera. But I could feel it. That cold, heavy sensation of being watched had returned, stronger than ever. I whipped around, half expecting to see the figures standing behind me, but the room was empty, just silence and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. When I looked back at the video, the figures were closer now, surrounding my reflection on the couch. One of them reached out a long, skeletal hand, brushing its fingers against the side of my head. My reflection twitched, and for the first time, it looked afraid. The video cut to black. I sat there for a long time, phone still lying on the floor. My thoughts raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. But it felt real. Too real. That's when my phone buzzed again. Another email. This one had a subject line, "Meet us." The sender's address was gibberish, random letters and numbers that meant nothing. Against every ounce of common sense, I opened the email. The message was short, just a single line of text. The archive is the only way out. Below it was an address, coordinates, actually. I copied them into a map app and saw that it was leading me back to the lab, specifically to the basement. My first instinct was to ignore it, to throw my phone in the trash and never set foot in that building again. But something about the message stuck with me. The archive is the only way out. Out of what? What was I trapped in? And why did it feel like ignoring it would be worse than going back? I grabbed my car keys and headed out, trying to convince myself I wasn't making the worst decision of my life. The drive to the lab was quiet, the streets eerily empty for the time of night. When I pulled into the parking lot, the building loomed like a massive tombstone, its windows dark and lifeless. The front door was unlocked. That shouldn't have been possible. Security protocols required a keycard after hours. But I didn't question it. The silence inside was suffocating. Every step I took echoing down the empty halls. I made my way to the basement, the chill in the air growing stronger with every flight of stairs I descended. When I reached the media storage room, the door was ajar. It swung open easily as I pushed it. revealing the same chaos of hard drives and binders I'd seen earlier. But this time, the room felt different. Wrong. In the center of the room, the old desktop was already powered on, its screen glowing faintly. A single file was open, a live feed. It was my office again. The camera angle was different this time, lower, like someone was crawling on the floor. The figures were back, crowding the frame, their bodies distorting and shifting unnaturally. And then, slowly, the camera turned, panning toward the open door of my office. I watched in horror as the view moved down the hallway, closer and closer to the storage room where I stood. I spun around, expecting to see them standing in the doorway, but it was empty. When I turned back to the screen, the camera had stopped just outside the storage room. The view lingered there for a moment before a hand, long, thin, and impossibly pale, reached out and pushed the door open. The video cut to black. Behind me, the door creaked. The sound of the door creaking behind me was like ice water down my spine. My breath caught, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I didn't want to turn around, didn't want to see what was standing there, but I had no choice. Slowly, I twisted my head, bracing for the worst. The room was empty, or at least it looked that way. The door was slightly ajar, swaying faintly as if someone, or something, had just pushed it open. My gut screamed at me to run, but my legs were rooted to the spot. The silence in the room felt alive, heavy, like it was pressing down on me from all sides. And then I saw it. A shadow, not cast by me or anything else in the room, slithered across the floor, long and thin, heading toward the far wall where the shelves were stacked high with binders and hard drives. The shadow stopped beneath a particular shelf, pooling there unnaturally, like ink spreading across water. I don't know what possessed me to follow it. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was that message. The archive is the only way out. Whatever the reason, I found myself moving toward the shelf, my hands trembling as I reached for the binder directly above the shadow. It was labeled in faded, blocky handwriting. Initiation protocols. Inside, there was only one piece of paper. One line of text printed neatly in the center of the page. Play it. I didn't have to ask what it was. My eyes drifted back to the glowing screen of the desktop in the middle of the room. A new file had appeared, its name blinking ominously on the screen. Exit.mp4. Every instinct in my body told me to shut the computer off and leave, but I couldn't. My fingers moved on their own, the mouse clicking on the file before my brain could catch up. The video began, and what I saw was impossible. It was the media storage room, exactly as it was now, but brighter, like the lights had been turned up to an unnatural intensity. Shelves loomed taller than they should have, stretching up beyond what the room's ceiling should allow. Shadows flickered along the edges of the screen, dancing like firelight. And at the center of it all was me. Or something that looked like me. The version of me in the video stood in front of the same desktop, staring blankly at the camera. Its movements were stiff, puppet-like, as it reached for the keyboard and typed something I couldn't make out. Then it turned to face the screen directly, and for the first time I saw its face. It wasn't mine. Not entirely. The features were right. My eyes, my mouth, my crooked nose. But they were distorted, stretched and warped in subtle, wrong ways, as if someone had tried to sculpt me from memory and gotten lazy with the details. The thing smiled, wide and unnatural, then raised one hand to point directly at the camera. No, not at the camera, at me. The screen flickered, and suddenly, the figure wasn't alone. The distorted shadows from earlier began to emerge, their shapes solidifying into the same impossibly tall, faceless figures I'd seen in the previous videos. They surrounded the thing that looked like me, their movements synchronized, almost ritualistic. The me in the video spoke. Its voice was a perfect mimic of mine, but hollow, emotionless. "The archive isn't a way out," it said, tilting its head in that unnatural, jerking motion. "It's a door." The screen went black, but before I could react, the entire room shifted. The shelves began to creak, the walls seeming to ripple like the surface of a disturbed pond. The air grew heavier, colder, and that feeling of being watched intensified until I couldn't take it anymore. I turned toward the door, ready to bolt, but the doorway wasn't there anymore. In its place was a long, dark corridor that stretched endlessly into the void. At the far end, faintly illuminated by a pale, flickering light, was a figure. It was standing perfectly still, but I knew it was waiting for me. A voice, mine, but not mine, echoed through the room, soft and mocking. "You can't leave, not yet. They're waiting for you." I spun back toward the computer, desperate for some kind of escape, and noticed the binder in my hands had changed. The pages inside were blank now, except for a single sentence scrawled across the middle in red ink. "The exit is through the video." Heart pounding, I clicked on exit.mp4 again, but this time the screen didn't show a video. It was a live feed of me. The camera seemed to be floating, circling around me, as I stood in the middle of the storage room. In the feed, the shadows had fully emerged, the figures looming behind me, closer than ever. My reflection didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me through the screen with that same unsettling, distorted smile. And then, the voice spoke again, this time from the screen. "You're part of it now." The shadows in the video moved first, their hands stretching toward my reflection. And as they did, I felt it. Cold, claw-like fingers brushing against my shoulders, my neck, my back. I screamed and turned, swinging wildly, but there was nothing there. When I looked back at the screen, the figures were gone. The video was gone. The desktop was off. The room silent once more. But the door, my way out, had returned, slightly ajar, just like before. I didn't hesitate. I ran. I don't remember how I got home that night. The next thing I knew, I was in my bed, drenched in sweat, the binder from the archive sitting on the nightstand. Only now, the words on the cover were gone. Just a blank, meaningless folder. I haven't gone back to the lab since. I've been ignoring calls from Dr. Andrews, ignoring the emails that keep piling up in my inbox, each one more urgent than the last. But last night, I woke up to find my phone buzzing again. A new email, no subject, no text, just another attachment. Exit.mp4. I haven't opened it, not yet, but I can feel it. Whatever I let out of the archive, whatever followed me home, it's not done with me. And now, I'm afraid it never will be. I'm a live-in nanny for a wealthy family. I found their daughter's drawings of creatures that look like me, but aren't quite human. She calls them the shadows and says they come out when I'm asleep. When I took the job, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. Being a live-in nanny for a wealthy family sounded like a dream come true. Room and board included, a salary way higher than anything I'd earned before, and just one kid to look after, a sweet, artistic 8-year-old named Sophie. How hard could it be, right? The family, Mr. and Mrs. Connors, lived in a sprawling, modern house tucked away in a private neighbourhood. The kind of place where the gates are more like fortresses, and you need a code just to drive down the street. When I arrived for the interview, I felt like I was stepping into a different world. Marble floors, enormous windows overlooking perfectly manicured gardens, and walls covered in art I'd probably never be able to afford, even if I worked here for 20 years. Mrs. Connors was polite but distant, the kind of woman who always seemed busy with something more important than whatever conversation she was having. Mr. Connors didn't say much, just gave me a firm handshake and a quick nod, before disappearing into what I assumed was his home office. And then there was Sophie. She had this wispy, fair hair and these big, curious eyes that seemed to take in everything all at once. She was polite and quiet during the interview, clutching a sketchbook to her chest like it was her most prized possession. I remember her looking up at me with a tiny smile and saying, "You look like them." I didn't think much of it at the time. Kids say weird things, right? The Connors hired me on the spot. A week later, I moved in. My room was on the second floor, just down the hall from Sophie's. It was cozy, with a window that overlooked the backyard and a bathroom all to myself. Honestly, I felt spoiled. The first few days were uneventful. Sophie was an easy kid to look after. She loved to draw, spent hours in her room sketching or painting, and rarely caused any trouble. She was a little shy, sure, but sweet in a way that made me want to protect her. The Connors mostly left me to it, occasionally popping in to check on her but otherwise staying busy with their own lives. Then I started noticing the drawings. Sophie's art wasn't your typical kid stuff. No stick figures or sunny landscapes. Her drawings were detailed. Too detailed for an 8-year-old, if I'm being honest. She'd fill page after page with these dark, spindly creatures. Long limbs, hollow eyes, twisted mouths that seemed to stretch unnaturally wide. They were always surrounded by black smudges, like shadows crawling over them. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe she just had a vivid imagination or had seen something scary on TV. But then I noticed a pattern. In some of the drawings, the creatures looked disturbingly familiar. One had long dark hair like mine. Another wore a sweater that looked exactly like the one I'd worn the day before. And in every drawing, the creatures were staring straight ahead, their hollow eyes fixated on something or someone beyond the paper. When I asked her about them, she just shrugged and said, "They're the shadows. They come out when you're asleep." The next morning, I asked Sophie about the drawing. "Why do they look like me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. She tilted her head, as if the question confused her. "They're not you," she said matter-of-factly. "They just pretend to be." That gave me chills, but I tried to laugh it off. Why would they do that? "To trick people," she said, her tone so casual it made my skin crawl. "They're good at it, but they can't come out in the light." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just changed the subject. But her words stuck with me. That night, I made sure every light in my room was on before I went to bed. At some point, I woke up to the sound of a faint tapping noise. It was coming from the mirror on the wall. My first thought was that I was dreaming, but the longer I stared, the more I realized something was off. My reflection wasn't moving. It just stood there, staring back at me with those hollow eyes from Sophie's drawings. That's when the noises started. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My throat locked up, and all I could do was stare at the mirror, at it. My reflection, or whatever it was, tilted its head slightly, the same way Sophie did when she asked a question she already knew the answer to. But I wasn't moving. I was frozen in bed, my hands clutching the blanket so tightly my knuckles ached. The tapping continued. Slow, deliberate, like fingers drumming against the glass. The reflection's hollow eyes didn't blink, didn't even flinch when I finally found the courage to look away and switch on my bedside lamp. As soon as the light hit the mirror, the tapping stopped. My reflection was normal again. Just me, wide-eyed and pale, staring back at myself like I'd seen a ghost. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to convince myself it had been a dream, a really vivid, messed up dream. But when I looked down, my blanket was still twisted tightly in my hands. The next morning, I decided to talk to Mrs. Connors about the mirror. Maybe there was some weird explanation for what I saw, like it was old and warped, or there was a draft behind it that made it move, something logical, something that didn't involve shadows or creatures pretending to be me. She barely looked up from her phone when I brought it up. "Oh, the mirror in the guest room. We got it at an estate sale. It's probably an antique or something," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "If it's bothering you, I can have someone take it down." I wanted to push, to ask if she'd ever noticed anything strange about it. But her tone made it clear the conversation was over. I left the kitchen feeling like I'd hit a wall, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more she wasn't telling me. That afternoon, Sophie and I were in the living room, and she was drawing again. I hadn't brought up the mirror with her. I wasn't sure if I wanted to know what she'd say, but she brought it up herself. "You shouldn't look at it for too long," she said, her pencil moving across the page without hesitation. My stomach tightened. "Why not?" "They get stronger when you look," she said, not bothering to glance up. "That's how they know you see them." I asked her about the shadows again. At first, she didn't want to talk about them. She just kept drawing, filling another page with one of her grotesque creatures. But when I pressed, she sighed like a grown-up who'd been asked the same question 100 times. "They're not supposed to be here," she said. "They're from somewhere else. They only come out when it's dark, or when you're not paying attention." Her voice was so calm, so matter-of-fact, it sent chills through me. "Why do they look like people?" I asked. "To trick you," she said again, echoing what she'd told me before. But this time she added, "They don't want to scare you. Not at first." I didn't know what to say to that. Instead, I asked her if there were rules for keeping them away. Her pencil paused mid-stroke and she finally looked up at me. "Stay in the light," she said, "and don't look at them if they look back." That night, I left the lights on again. Every single one. I even dragged the lamp from the living room into my room, just in case. But when I woke up around 2 a.m., the room was dark. The bulb in the bedside lamp had burned out. The other lamp, the one I'd brought in, was unplugged. I knew I hadn't unplugged it, and my heart started racing as I reached for my phone. The flashlight cast a small, shaky beam of light around the room, and I scanned every corner, every shadow, convinced I wasn't alone. That's when I heard it. A soft creak, like a door opening somewhere in the house. It wasn't Sophie's room. I checked her first. She was fast asleep, her sketchbook clutched against her chest like a shield. The sound had come from somewhere else, somewhere farther down the hall. The Connors had mentioned it in passing during my first week, but I'd never been down there. The door was always locked, and they'd said it was just for storage. But now, as I stood in the hallway, I could see the door was open just a crack, a sliver of darkness spilling into the dimly lit corridor. I told myself to go back to bed, to lock my door and deal with it in the morning, but my feet had other plans. Step by step, I crept toward the basement door, my phone's flashlight trembling in my hand. When I reached it, I hesitated. I could hear something faint coming from below, a soft, raspy whisper, like wind slipping through a crack in the window. Except it wasn't windy, and the sound wasn't random. It was rhythmic, almost like someone breathing. I'm not the kind of person who scares easily, but I swear, every night after Sophie went to bed, I'd hear soft shuffling sounds coming from her room. At first, I chalked it up to her moving around in bed or getting up to grab a glass of water. But the more I listened, the more it felt wrong. It didn't sound like footsteps. It was softer, almost like something dragging across the floor. When I peeked in on her, she'd always be fast asleep, curled up under her blankets with her sketchbook on the nightstand. One night, I decided to stay up late and see if I could figure out what was making the noise. I sat in my room with the lights off, the door cracked open just enough to see down the hallway. Around midnight, the noises started again. That soft, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. I crept out of my room, heart pounding, and peeked into Sophie's room. She was in bed, just like always, her breathing slow and steady, but her sketchbook was open on the floor, even though I was positive I'd put it back on her nightstand earlier. On the open page was a new drawing. This time, the creature was standing at the foot of a bed that looked exactly like mine. I shone my flashlight down the stairs, but the beam barely reached the bottom. The basement was pitch black, the kind of darkness that swallows light whole. I thought about calling out, but something about the silence made me keep my mouth shut. Instead, I just listened. The breathing sound was louder now, coming from somewhere deep in the shadows. It wasn't steady, like a person's breath. It was erratic, rasping in and out, like whatever was down there was struggling to breathe at all. I took a step down, then another. The stairs creaked beneath my weight, each sound echoing in the darkness. When I was halfway down, the breathing stopped. I froze. My flashlight flickered, and I slapped the side of my phone, willing it to stay on. That's when I saw it. At the bottom of the stairs, just barely visible in the faint light, was a figure. It was hunched over, its long arms reaching the floor, and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. It just stood there, waiting. And then it smiled. I don't remember making the decision to run. 1 second, I was frozen on the stairs, staring at that impossibly wide, twisted smile, and the next, I was stumbling back up, nearly tripping over myself. The flashlight on my phone flickered again, and for a horrifying moment, I thought it was going to die completely. The stairs creaked behind me, louder and closer than my own footsteps. I didn't dare look back. Whatever was down there, I could feel it coming up the stairs, fast and deliberate, like it was enjoying the chase. When I reached the top, I slammed the basement door shut and twisted the lock. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the handle, but the click of the lock was the most satisfying sound I'd ever heard. Silence. I pressed my ear against the door, struggling to catch my breath. There was nothing on the other side. No footsteps, no breathing, no movement, just stillness. But then came the scratching, soft at first, like nails gently dragging across the wood. Then harder, more frantic, until it sounded like claws tearing into the door. I backed away, my heart pounding so loudly it felt like it was echoing through the house. And then it stopped. The rest of the night was a blur. I locked myself in my room, pushed the dresser against the door, and left every light in the house on. Sleep was out of the question, so I sat on my bed, with my back against the wall, clutching my phone like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. When the first rays of sunlight streamed through the window, I finally worked up the courage to leave my room. The house was eerily quiet, almost too quiet. Sophie's door was still closed, and I couldn't hear her soft, steady breathing like I usually did when I checked on her. I knocked gently. "Sophie, you awake?" No answer. My stomach dropped as I pushed the door open. Her bed was empty, the blankets neatly tucked like she hadn't slept there at all. Her sketchbook was gone too, along with the pencils she always kept on her nightstand. I called her name, my voice trembling, but the house felt empty, like she'd vanished. I was about to call Mrs. Connors when I saw something on her wall that stopped me cold. One of her drawings, one I hadn't noticed before, was taped above her bed. It was another shadowy figure, but this one wasn't like the others. This one was smaller, hunched over, with long limbs that stretched across the page. And it had Sophie's face. When Mrs. Connors finally came home that afternoon, I told her Sophie was missing. I expected her to panic, to call the police, to do something. Instead, she just looked at me with that same distracted expression she always wore, like I'd told her we were out of milk. "She does that sometimes," she said. "She's probably hiding somewhere. She'll come back when she's ready." Her voice was calm, too calm, and it sent a wave of frustration and fear through me. "She's 8, I said, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. "She didn't just wander off. She didn't even take her shoes." Mrs. Connors sighed like I was the one being unreasonable. "If you're that worried, check the basement." My stomach dropped. "The basement?" She raised an eyebrow. "That's where she likes to hide. It's fine, really. She does it all the time." I stared at her, waiting for some sign that she was joking, but her expression didn't change. She grabbed her keys and purse, said she had a meeting to get to, and left me standing there, completely stunned. I don't know why I listened. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was the way she said it so casually, like the basement was the most obvious place to look. Either way, I found myself standing in front of the door again, my hand trembling as I turned the lock. The air was colder this time, the kind of cold that sinks into your skin and makes your bones ache. My phone flashlight barely cut through the darkness as I descended the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. "Sophie," I called, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. When I reached the bottom, I realized just how big the basement was. It stretched farther than I'd thought, the far corners swallowed in shadows that even my flashlight couldn't penetrate. The floor was covered in dust, but there were footprints, small ones, leading deeper into the darkness. I followed them. The air grew colder the farther I went, and the faint smell of mildew gave way to something sharper, something metallic. My flashlight flickered again, and I stopped, frozen in place. "Sophie," I called again, my voice trembling. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the light, there was a figure crouched on the ground. It was small, child-sized, and its back was turned to me. My heart leapt. "Sophie!" I rushed toward her, relief flooding through me. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. Her hair was too long, her limbs too thin, her joints bending in ways that didn't seem possible. "Sophie," I said again, my voice cracking. The figure turned its head slowly, and my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't Sophie. It was one of them. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and that twisted, unnatural smile stretched across its face. Behind it, in the darkness, something moved. Before I could react, a voice whispered from the shadows, soft and raspy, like wind through broken glass. "She's with us now." My flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, I saw them. Dozens of them, crawling out of the darkness, their twisted limbs and hollow eyes all fixated on me. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back, didn't stop until I was out of the basement and slamming the door shut behind me. My hands fumbled with the lock, but I finally managed to twist it into place. And then I heard it again, the scratching. Softer this time, almost teasing like they knew I couldn't escape them. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the scratching. It wasn't just at the basement door anymore. It was everywhere. The walls, the floorboards, even the window in my room, which I knew was 2 stories off the ground. By morning, the scratching stopped, but the silence was worse. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the first move. I thought about leaving, just grabbing my bag and running as far away as I could, but the thought of Sophie kept me rooted in place. Wherever she was, I couldn't just abandon her. I spent the morning searching the house for clues. Every corner, every room, every shadow felt like it was watching me. I found nothing until I stepped into Sophie's room. Her bed was still perfectly made, and her toys were untouched, like she hadn't been there in days. But her sketchbook, the one that was missing, was lying on her desk, wide open. It hadn't been there before. I hesitated, but curiosity won out. The page was filled with more of her shadowy figures, but this time, there was something different. In the center of the page, one of the creatures was holding hands with a smaller figure. A girl. Sophie. Her face was blank, just an oval without eyes, a nose or a mouth. But I recognized the shape of her hair, the way she always wore it tied in a loose ponytail. Around them, the shadows were gathered in a circle, their hollow eyes fixed on her. Below the drawing, in Sophie's careful handwriting, were 3 words that made my stomach drop. "She's won now." I didn't hear the knock at first. It was soft, almost polite, but it still made me jump. I hadn't expected anyone, and the Connors never came back during the day. My heart was racing as I made my way to the front door. Through the peephole, I saw a man standing on the porch. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark coat that looked out of place in the warm morning sun. His face was pale, almost grey, And his eyes. Something about them was wrong. They didn't look hollow like the shadows, but they didn't look human either. They were too bright, too focused. He knocked again, louder this time, and I instinctively stepped back. "Miss," he called, his voice calm and even. "I'm here to help." Help? How could he know I needed help? My mind raced as I tried to come up with an explanation. Maybe Mrs. Connors had called him. Maybe he was a private investigator, or someone who specialized in finding missing kids. But something about him felt off. "I'm fine," I said through the door, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't need help." There was a pause. Then, in a softer voice, he said, "Sophie does." My blood ran cold. "How do you know Sophie?" I demanded, my hand tightening on the doorknob. "I know where she is," he said simply. "But you have to invite me in." Every instinct screamed at me not to. I didn't know who or what this man was, but the way he said it made my skin crawl. His tone wasn't pleading. It was expectant, like he already knew I would let him in. "I'm calling the police," I said, stepping away from the door. "Do you think they'll believe you?" he asked. His voice had changed. It was sharper now, colder. "Do you even believe yourself?" I didn't call the police. By the time I worked up the nerve to check the peephole again, he was gone. The porch was empty, but the air felt heavier, like the house itself was holding a secret. When I turned back toward the living room, Sophie's sketchbook was lying open on the coffee table. I hadn't brought it downstairs, and I knew I'd left it in her room. The new drawing stopped me in my tracks. It was me. Not the shadows. Me. I was standing at the front door, looking through the peephole, but there was someone else in the drawing too. The man. He was on the other side of the door, but his face wasn't right. His mouth stretched too wide, his teeth too sharp, and his eyes were hollow. I grabbed the sketchbook and ran back to my room. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what was happening, but nothing made sense. The shadows, Sophie's drawings, the man at the door. It was all connected, but how? The sun was starting to set, and the light in my room grew dimmer. I reached for the lamp on my nightstand, but the bulb flickered as soon as I turned it on. "No," I whispered, twisting the switch again. The bulb flared for a moment, then went out completely. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, but even that felt like a fragile shield against the encroaching darkness. Shadows pulled in the corners of the room, deeper and darker than they should have been. I could feel them watching me. "Sophie," I whispered, clutching the sketchbook to my chest. For a moment, there was nothing, just the oppressive silence pressing down on me. And then I heard it. Her voice. It came from the hallway, soft and distant, like she was standing at the far end of the corridor. "Come play with me," she said, her tone light and sing-songy, the way she used to sound when we played hide and seek. My breath hitched. "Sophie?" "Come play," she repeated, closer this time. I stepped into the hallway, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The light barely reached the end of the corridor, but I could see a small figure standing there. She was turned away from me, her long hair falling over her shoulders. "Sophie," I said again, my voice shaking. "It's me. Are you okay?" She didn't answer. She just started walking toward the basement door. I wanted to stop her, to grab her and pull her away, but my feet wouldn't move. All I could do was watch as she opened the door and stepped into the darkness below. Before I could follow, the air around me grew cold, and that raspy, broken glass voice whispered in my ear, "She's ours now." The flashlight flickered, and when I turned back toward the basement door, it was wide open. Sophie was gone, and in her place, at the top of the stairs, was a shadowy figure with hollow eyes and a smile that stretched too far. I stood there, paralyzed, staring at the figure at the top of the basement stairs. Its hollow eyes bore into me, unblinking and endless, as if they could see right through me, into my thoughts, my memories, my fears. Its smile widened, the corners of its mouth stretching unnaturally, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth that seemed to glisten even in the dim light. The door slammed shut before I could move. The sound echoed through the house. A final, deafening punctuation. I lunged forward and grabbed the handle, twisting and pulling, but it wouldn't budge. The wood felt unnaturally cold, like ice against my skin. The scratching started again, this time louder and more frantic, as if the shadows on the other side were trying to claw their way out. Or maybe they were trying to pull me in. The house was no longer quiet. Whispers swirled around me, too many voices to count, overlapping and blending, until I couldn't tell what they were saying. Some were soft, like Sophie's, pleading and childlike. Others were deep and guttural, speaking in tones that made my skin crawl. They were everywhere. "Come with us," one voice hissed from behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. "She's waiting," another whispered, this one closer, right in my ear. I stumbled back, clutching the sketchbook to my chest like it was a lifeline. My flashlight flickered again, and in its stuttering beam, I saw them, shadows crawling along the walls and ceiling, moving in ways that didn't make sense. Their limbs stretched and twisted, their hollow eyes glowing faintly as they crept closer. I ran to my room and slammed the door, shoving the dresser against it like it could keep them out. The whispers didn't stop. They only grew louder, angrier. I turned the flashlight toward the mirror on the wall, the one I'd been too afraid to look at since that first night. The glass wasn't reflecting my room anymore. Instead, it showed the basement, the place I'd just fled from. The stairs stretched down into the darkness, but at the very bottom Sophie stood, staring up at me. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and blank, and her lips moved silently, as if she were trying to tell me something. And then she smiled. It wasn't her smile. It was their smile, too wide, too sharp. Her head tilted unnaturally to the side, and a shadowy hand reached out from behind her, its long, spindly fingers curling around her shoulder. "She's with us," the raspy voice whispered again, this time from the mirror itself. I dropped the flashlight. The room plunged into darkness, and for a moment, I thought it was over. But then the light in the mirror began to shift, revealing something new. It wasn't just Sophie anymore. It was me. My reflection stood in the basement now, staring back at me with hollow eyes. Behind it, the shadows gathered, their shapes twisting and writhing like they were alive. When the mirror shattered, the light went out. For a moment, the world was pitch black, and I thought I was gone, that the shadows had finally taken me. But then, slowly, the faint light of morning crept through the curtains. The whispers were gone. The scratching had stopped. The house was silent again, eerily so. I pushed the dresser away from the door and stepped into the hallway, half expecting to see the shadows waiting for me. But there was nothing, just an empty house. Sophie was gone. Her room was exactly as I'd left it, but there was no sign of her, not even her drawings. The sketchbook I'd been holding had vanished, leaving only a faint outline of dust on the coffee table where I'd found it. I left that house the same day, abandoning everything I'd brought with me. I didn't even stop to tell the Connors. I didn't care what they thought. Whatever was in that house, whatever had taken Sophie, wasn't something I could fight. For weeks, I tried to move on, but the shadows stayed with me. I'd see them in the corners of my apartment, just out of sight, or catch a glimpse of hollow eyes staring back at me in the mirror. And at night, when the lights were out, I'd hear the scratching. Soft at first, then louder. They're waiting.